Well, not just in South Africa or the African continent, but certainly in parts of Asia, in Europe, and North America, perhaps South America as well. The issues of societal change once again comes to the fore for a variety of reasons, but the general sense is that the world is almost a very dissatisfied world that needs some massive change. But I specifically want to zone in on the issues of the youth, not just in my country, in South Africa, but the youth around the world. And the big question, or the big picture we're asking is, around youth activism, just how important is youth activism. So I've got Tessa Dooms with me, and Tessa, I appreciate your time and welcome to the Ashraf Garda show. Hopefully, the first of many to give us big pictures on important issues and your opinions that I clearly value.
Thank you for having me, Ashraf, and
thank you. So
on the new platform.
you've been your T-shirt, which we can't see now, so maybe don't shift it because it'll change things. It says Youth Lab, and I know. Oh, there you are, Youth Lab, right? I know you've been involved, with that particular organization, which may be yours or that you set up. You've also been involved with the National Planning Commission in terms of the youth department. But maybe I should stop talking. I'm going to give you a 1 minute pitch about what is it that you do. So go ahead and tell us.
So I'm a lifelong youth practitioner. I'm a lifelong youth worker. Started doing youth work in the community I was raised in, Eldorado Park, then went on to lecture for a few years in sociology, and then joined Youth Lab, which was started by 3 young people. And as I joined it, I got the opportunity to contribute in terms of youth policy, but also community youth work that I haven't done in a long time. And thankfully, that led down a path where I really understood that youth work didn't need to only be directly with young people, but also in policy spaces. And I've gotten to work with the National Planning Commission. I've gotten to work with organizations like the African Union and other international organizations to try and drive a youth agenda, but particularly drive the youth opportunities for people in Africa and really bring out the voice and the opportunities and the unique contributions that young people on the continent can make to the world.
Okay, do you have like a permanent job? Because you seem like you do many things. So what's the one thing that takes up most of your time?
The one thing that takes up most of my time is I'm the new director of Jasora Consulting, which is a consulting firm that myself and my partner set up about a year and a few months ago. And so the core of that is, again, about building African democracy, building African development by mainstreaming it into the organizations that seek to build themselves as organizations and their profits and what they do, but make sure that what they do aligns to the development of Africa, and particularly because of my interest in youth, through valuing its young people.
There's so many issues around business and business with purpose that we can maybe touch on just now. But let's zoom in then specifically on the issue of trying to understand the big picture into youth activism. So when I put that to you to say, let's talk about the big picture into youth activism, what went through your mind? I mean, what did you make of that question or statement for debate?
Yeah, so I think the question about what's the state of youth activism is usually asked because we don't see youth as this kind of people who are coming out and are forming a party or lobbying or forming a business. And so we sometimes think that young people aren't active unless we see them standing together as a collective. And so for me, when I think about youth activism, I'm thinking about the activism and the activities of young people in their everyday lives. And I'm thinking about the ways in which young people are contributing, even when they're on their own, even when they're in obscure spaces. Because for me, young people and youth activism shouldn't be this thing that is a standalone in society. It has to be mainstreamed, and particularly in societies like ours, where over 60% of our population is under the age of 35. I think we really owe it to ourselves to think about young people as able to act and able to add value and able to change things, even when they're doing it in an everyday way, as opposed to in one of these grand ways by starting a party or on the streets or having grand movements.
So do you? So in your sense, then, what would be like the quick one-line definition of youth activism? Youth activism means what?
Youth activism is every time a young person, and I define a young person as somebody who is in a transition from being a child to being an adult within the society they are in, and whatever that means for that society. But somebody who's in that transitionary phase and is building the agency to act and transform their own lives and the lives of their societies. That's youth activism for me. A young person who is saying, I have the ability to contribute, I have the ability to self-determine, I have the ability to contribute and bring change to my own life, the lives of others. And wherever I do that, I am an activist, acting on my own behalf and acting with the people who are in my circle in mind.
Okay, interesting. Do you get a sense that for many people, and let's say in South Africa specifically, when we talk about youth activism, it implies protest?
Yes. For many South Africans, youth activism has a particular look. And it looks like young people fighting for something. And that's part of a problematic definition. We associate young people with two things. We associate them with being a problem and with having problems. And so when young people are not fighting for something, when they're not being ferocious, when they're not being out there and being loud, we think that they're inactive. You actually don't want to have a society where a young person has to fight for everything, where a young person has to struggle and has to shout and has to decry things in order for them to happen. Young people are firstly people with rights, and they should have the right to education without having to fight for it. They should have the right to have safe communities without having to fight for it. They should have the right to participate in creating change without having to fight for it. And so if our vision in our minds is the only time young people are active is when they are in some form of combat or struggle, that's why we're missing the everyday activism that so many young people enact on a daily basis and keep this country moving forward in so many ways.
So where do you think this came up, where this concept of youth activism has been framed as protest and literally toying and people liking it and not liking it? Where did it all start to gain currency then?
I'm actually going to cite a politician here whose work probably on this doesn't come out much, but Hussein Ndlozi actually has written his PhD on the question around youth activism and how young people are portrayed, and good chronology in the South African context that I think can be applied to many developing contexts, but particularly on the continent, where because your history is one of struggle as a country, your young people have been in the forefront of fighting. And they've been in the forefront of change. And so as we've moved into a democratic era, we've moved with those same notions of change only comes through struggle because we've got such a long history of struggle. And I think what we've done is we've now compounded that, brought it into democracy, and then said that young people have to fight for things. And a few years ago, I put this to somebody in the ANC. Actually on a radio show. And I said to him, why is it that, politicians who themselves were young, when they started in politics and when they started taking up positions and they started, getting into things, are now saying that, young people must fight them for space. And he said simply that when they were fighting in a time where they didn't have power. And by the time they got power, they were exiting their youth. And so their youth was eaten, and now they're going to eat the youth of those who come after them, unless they're fought. And I was so disheartened by that, because I was like, what we're saying is that every generation will have to struggle. So there can't be a generation who can see that something needs to be changed and they can say, hi guys, let's change what we're doing because we need to move forward. They're going to have to fight for that. And so I've determined that I'm going to be part of the generation that is not going to make young people wrestle power. I'm going to be part of the generation that's going to make space for young people and make it easy for young people to see themselves as agents of change. And most importantly, is going to actually, be part of young people's development journey. Youth should not be a time of struggle. It should be a time of development. And in this country, we don't even know what development looks like.
Perhaps you can give us what's the difference between struggle and development?
So if you're saying that youth is a transition from being a child to an adult, how do you know that adulthood has been reached? In our country, we say, well, you're no longer a youth until you're 35. So when you turn 36, do you magically now get imbued with all of the traits that you need to take over the world and to be ready for the world? No, it's not a number. What needs to happen in a period of youth is you need to say, for a child to now transition and become a fruitful and fulfilling member of us, so that they are able to be on their own in the world and make a contribution. Development is about saying, what are the things you need to be a member of the society in a productive way? And can we give that to you in a period of time called youth? So I'll make an example that I always make about a country like Germany. Germany actually has a youth development policy that says we have youth in this country from the time you're about 16 to the time you're 24. And they have programs for each year of your life during that stage almost. And they've got particular benchmarks based on their country's history. So we all know that Nazi Germany in the Second World War had a big impression on that country's history. So one of the things that they put into their youth development journey is they make sure that their young people go and serve in another part of the country. So they're going to have an experience of another part of the country or another part of the world because they value integration. They value a society that's cohesive. So what do? They train their young people by exposing them to difference so that they can learn how to be cohesive. So that by the time you reach 24 in Germany, you've had so many opportunities to develop that the government can feel confident that you're going to be able to become a productive adult. And I think the reason why we've set our bar at 35 is because we don't have a plan. And so we just hope and hope and hope that by the time you're 35, you will somehow have gotten together what you need in order to be an adult, as opposed to saying, we know exactly where you're going and how you're going to get there, so that the end point is something you can see.
So you are saying effectively that that 35, and I'm not too sure who decided on that number, is really well beyond the age of what most societies would define as youth, isn't it?
Well, the 35 is something that we actually, as South Africa, very much have pushed onto ourselves. It's now become part of youth. The African Youth Charter says 35. And what it's done is it's made us lazy. Because honestly, by the time somebody's 35, I'm 36 now. I'm old enough to be a 15-year-old's mother. A 15-year-old would also be youth.
Yeah.
So while I was 35, I could have been in a youth category with somebody I was parenting. And that just doesn't make sense. Something is wrong about that. And I think it's because we've become lazy and we've given ourselves such latitude and said, well, we've got historical barriers and we've got all of these issues. We need to, give more people opportunities, without saying what the end goal is. And so people still, even if you ask a 50-year-old South African, what makes you sure that you are a successful adult in the world today? Many people don't know the answer to that. What makes you sure that you're a contributing member of the South African society? What does that mean to you? Many don't know the answer to that. And it's because we don't know the answer to that young people just keep on bumbling through. And you will hear people say at 40, I'm still youth because I still haven't found myself. I still haven't done all the things I need to do, because we're not being constructive about youth as a developmental journey. We're just calling it an age and hoping for the best.
So, what you've said for me is profound. I think it's particularly important. And I would think that even from your consultancy, that's the type of information that you'd want to feed through to society to say you need to rethink that. But Is that what you're doing right now? Meaning, are you pushing to just change that narrative as a starting point that youth can't be youth at 35? There has to be whatever 25 or whatever. That it is counterproductive to a society. Are you pushing that through?
Absolutely. And so we've spent, in my time at Youth Lab, in my time at the AU, spent a lot of time talking firstly with young people about this issue so that we start together seeing things differently, and young people together start seeing that it's counterproductive. It's not to their benefit to have indefinite youth. And so when we did consultations in 2015 with the then Deputy Minister of Presidency, who was responsible for youth equity, my biggest debates that myself and Youth Lab brought into that conversation, where we said, actually, we need to have a different conversation about this youth age. And we've seen now in the new draft of the youth policy for 2020, because they didn't really take that on board in 2015. In fact, it became one of the reasons why it was a problem. But now you've seen in 2020 that there's actually a consideration about reducing the youth age for the first time, which I think is a positive thing. But then it needs to be replaced by a developmental agenda. And so in the work that I've been doing with the National Planning Commission, as we've been reviewing the NDP, that's one of the suggestions we've made within the NDP, is that we need to have a broader conversation about what is the end goal when it comes to young people and rethink that. And then take that to even more specific areas. So I've been working around youth unemployment and youth entrepreneurship work, and changing that narrative from we need to get youth employed to saying, let's find different pathways. And you'll start hearing this kind of language that's starting to seep through government now, where we're saying we want to create a pathways approach from young people transitioning from education into the labor market, and not just getting a job, but having different economic opportunities based on different pathways that are being created. And maybe a final example of that is a contentious thing that came up last year with the Department of Basic Education when they started talking about the grade 9 exit. And that was actually part of work that we've been doing, because what we said was a lot of young people are falling out of the grade 9 level because they cannot transition into vocational training, but they cannot cope with the normal matric curriculum. So is there a way that you can give those young people a pathway, an exit opportunity into the TVET system, which I think was probably lost in that conversation. But that's the kind of thing that we're talking about, is let's be more intentional about youth development as opposed to just on its own.
So you raised some really important issues. I want to go back to that German example about a developmental plan for youth, which I can gather now is not part of formal education, because that's different. This is alongside it, right? So what stops South Africa from developing that plan to ensure that from 5 or 6 till 25, that all South African youth will have those life experiences which will make them far more well-rounded than they are right now, and this is why I have a self-interest as being part of the Champion South Africa movement. Goodness, we need champions in our country, which means it would prime them to be more likely to become champions than what they are now.
Right. So nothing really stops us except our own sense of what we want to accomplish, but also some leadership and vision. I think the first part of it is having the shift in mindset that says that youth development happens on its own. The second big thing is about having the end goal. Let us start defining what it means to be a South African who's contributing to your country and world, and what the most basic things are that a young person needs. And maybe part of what's also held us back is I think we've pigeonholed youth development to an economic conversation. So we've all become very consumed at this idea of if we can just get young people into jobs, they'll be fine. And that's not working, because firstly, young people aren't just going to get into jobs because of education or economic opportunity. They also need certain personal skills, interpersonal skills, psychosocial support, mental health support. They need to understand the world of work. They need to understand how they're going to create their world, and they need a sense of agency. That's not going to come through formal education. It's not even going to come through university. it's going to come through other means, and we need to be willing to create those means. One of the programs that we've neglected as a country that has worked well in other African countries is the National Youth Service. And so in Nigeria, for example, they have a National Youth Service where as you graduate from university or graduate from college, you are, like in the German example, you are sent to go to another province or another part of the country, and you do a year of service there. And that year of service is a twofold thing. One is you get to work in your field that you've just graduated from. So you're building up a year of experience. You're in a job. You're in a placement job that the state is paying for. But on the other hand, Nigeria's also had major issues in terms of ethnic violence, ethnic divisions, religious divisions. And so you get to understand other regions, other types of Nigerians, other people in the country. And at the same time, you're building some sense of independence because now you're living away from home. You're building some sense of living and working with other people and having to get some resilience. And so that program on its own as a National Youth Service does a lot of work in terms of a developmental agenda in 1 year that I think we've missed out the opportunity of doing in our own National Youth Service programs, which have not necessarily been well thought through.
So why not?
So it's
because that's the point. I mean, you've certainly been, you've had the year of the National Planning Commission before, and you've made that point. But you're not the only person. Many others too. South Africa, certainly politically, they've pronounced publicly, from going back to the ruling party, a better life for all. So there's been no debating the fact that the premise in a democratic South Africa was to ensure that there's a better life for all. But that's the vision or the wish list. Why do you think, therefore, those that are in positions of decision making haven't made those decisions that, in fact, then has created the template for a better life for all?
I think when it comes to youth development particularly, it's been a leadership crisis and a leadership vacuum. We haven't, and I'm not here talking about the fact that our leaders aren't young, which is an obvious problem. Just at a representation level, that's an obvious problem. But even the idea of youth workers and youth experts, not every young person is going to be an expert on youth development. You can be an expert on the experience of youth because you're young, but I don't expect you to understand youth development through osmosis. I had experiences as a youth worker in a community setting. I went into academia. I studied youth work. And so I became somebody who can think about youth work in this way because it's a set of expertise I have. And I don't think we've taken youth work seriously in that way in the country. And I think we've done it with a lot of other areas where our politicians don't need to be experts in order to lead areas. You don't need to have a brain trust of experts. You just need to have a brain trust of people who are politically aligned to you. And so we're losing out on the ability to harness expertise because we've replaced expertise with political expedience.
Should we have a minister of youth?
So absolutely not. And that might not be the answer you were expecting, but absolutely not. And the reason why is a ministry of youth centralizes the issue of youth as opposed to mainstreams it, right? So I actually like our country's model where youth is located in the presidency. And I think that's where youth should be located. Competencies around youth should be talking directly to national policy and should have the national and the political will to be able to go and speak to the Department of Transport, to go and able to speak to the Department of Water and Sanitation, to speak to the Department of Agriculture about a youth perspective. And every department in this country has a youth desk actually in their department. And they should be using that to skill it with a person who's actually a youth expert, again, so that you are mainstreaming youth as opposed to just putting it in one department. Because when you do that, you effectively actually just giving it a sideshow. You're making it like the Youth League is now. The Youth League thinks it's powerful, but it's actually just been reduced to a bit of a sideshow right now.
Good point. So let's then touch on this point that you made, that youth activism is not about protest, or not only about protest or struggle, but is this ongoing actualization of doing good for yourself and doing good for your country. Now, again, those things resonate. And again, I'll bring up the Champion South Africa point about when you succeed, your country succeeds, that type of thing. How do we get, or maybe are South African youth switched on to thinking that way, that their success means their country succeeds, and when their country succeeds, they succeed? Do they get that? And if the answer is yes, tell me why. They don't, tell me why. And maybe the bigger one then is, what's the program to ensure they get that? Because that's the issue that you spoke about first, that we have to have purpose. And the quicker we find purpose as individuals and collectives, the better.
So the answer is yes and no. Yes, because when I meet up with young people, not only are they eager to get to work and to get to doing things, they're actually doing them. And so I often talk about how community activists in this country and community workers and community mobilizers are by and large young people. That we have young people volunteering their time across this country, that we have young people starting their own businesses, we have young people starting cooperatives, we have young people who are engaged in the field of academia, and they all are pushing on their own steam. And if you ask them if they are, have that perspective where they're contributing to the country, they'll say to you, no. Not because they're not doing anything, but because what they do is unseen, it's unrecognized, it's unvalued. And young people in this country generally feel unseen and unvalued. They feel like unless they are in the streets burning things, unless they're breaking the system, no one is looking at them, no one is seeing them, no one is valuing them. And they're not wrong. And the flip side of that is when they do then take extraordinary measures, when they do make their voices heard, they then are called rude, and they're called disrespectful. If they go to the streets and they put out their grievances there, they are met with police. It's an unfortunate truth in this country that when young people decide they're going to gather, the police meet them at their gathering before they come together. That's where we are now. And so young people don't feel like they're seen until they're a problem. And so they don't feel like they're part of it.
Does that happen because that too often youth protests for legitimate reasons in South Africa, and I'm talking in recent times now, have spilled over into acts of violence, into acts of arson? And I'm now talking from the youth side. We can talk about the police at another time. Do you think that's why that's happened, that it does tend to spiral out of control and turn a great cause into bad PR?
My experience is that young people don't go out trying to be violent. They go out trying to be heard. And they often respond with violence. There's an innate fear. And I don't know who protested during apartheid have the same experience. But young people feel like there's an innate fear of them. That the state and the system and so as soon as they say, okay, we're going to gather or we're going to make our voices heard, that the state is already ready. People are ready to fight them. People are ready to make things difficult for them. And so I don't blame young people for being combative. I don't think young people in this country on a general basis are waking up and trying to be violent. That treats them like they are perpetrators even before they do anything wrong.
Do you think we speak far too much about June 16th and Youth Day, that it's celebrated now and it's just come and gone a few days ago? Do you think we speak far too much about it?
I think we speak in the wrong ways about it. And I personally have grown incredibly tired of every June 16 having somebody say the June 16 generation had a mission. They were the ones who were willing to fight for things. What is your mission and what are you willing to fight for? Why don't you have the spirit of the June 16 76 group? And the reason why I'm tired of it is not because I don't appreciate that moment and I don't appreciate what was done in that moment, but I feel like it's being used as a way to kind of almost make young people today feel inferior. It's being used tactically to silence young people. It's being used tactically to say to young people, you're not good enough. You're not as good as the generation that came before you. And again, it goes back to my point of young people just feeling unseen, unheard, and unappreciated in this country and
But
undervalued in this country. And like they have to always fight before somebody says that they're doing
but
anything
who
of
would want to do that
consequence.
deliberately? Who would want to effectively, deliberately undermine young people?
There are at least three categories of those people. People who see young people as a threat to their own positions of power or livelihoods. And we've heard this from even the workers' organization when we started doing things like the youth employment tax incentive, where the unions were saying, these young people are just coming to take our jobs. So the people who are afraid of displacement. The second category of people are people who just don't bother to understand young people, who don't bother to get to know them, who don't bother to get to see beyond kind of the veil that they ascribe to young people and beyond their own perceptions. And so they don't know who the young people of the country are, and so they can't value them, they can't know them. And the third group is probably the group I worry about the most, is that people who are willing to use young people and people who see young people as tokens to be manipulated and used for their own ends. And in this country, we've got worrying, particularly in terms of business and politics, where young people's abilities, their solidarity, their voices are being bought as part of patronage networks, as part of networks of careerism, and young people are being used as tokens. And so people who want to control young people often don't want to value them correctly.
You, in some of the notes you've sent me, you specifically referenced the fees must fall movement as being not the gold standard. Okay, explain that.
Yes, fees must fall. I would explain it, but I think Jose Chicane, in his book, building Breaking a Rainbow, Building a Nation. Almost got it
And a
wrong.
book that I've read
I think
and we all
explains
need to read. Yeah.
It explains it a little better than I do, because essentially fees must fall has become the golden standard because it was the standard of protest that was seen, and protest that was seen as youth-led and validated as youth-led. But it was also a protest of people with means to be seen, with a space where they were already seen as somewhat valuable, where they were going against the system and in a space where they were engaging with people who were taking them somewhat seriously. But they are not the first young people in this country to protest. In fact, even in the university space, before fallism, I mean, I've been in the university system for longer than I'd like to remember. But it was in the early 2000s that I experienced my first student protest. And even then it was about fees. But even if we took away the university context, service delivery protests in this country are led by young people. There are many movements. The gender-based violence movement is being led by young women. And so we use fees must fall as a standard, but we forget that fees must fall almost had an easy route to the spotlight. And even its leaders, its most prominent leaders, are not the most underprivileged people in the society, are not people who had no access to a voice. Many of them were either political elites or economic elites. And so they could be a proxy to giving fees must fall students who are more marginalized that spotlight and that voice. And so it's not the golden standard. I'm not saying that it's irrelevant. I'm not saying it's not useful. I'm not even saying it wasn't good. But I think that when we say fees must fall is the standard, we are eradicating and again erasing many young people in this country who are doing a world of good, who are active, who are raising their voices. And because they don't have the means to be seen, they are not seen.
I mean, I think you raised such an important issue that Are we in danger of, if I go to June 16th now, using one day, one image, Hector Peterson, who passes on, but he's not the only person who was killed, right? And then that becomes the symbol forever, and then Fees Must Fall, the same thing. But in between all of that, there are hundreds of major struggles, mini struggles, some that with the benefit of social media are being able to be amplified, others without that benefit and without those the mobile phones now with video. I'm thinking about George Floyd. We don't know about, right? So there is this attempt to just signpost one or two events, and they determine what happens to a group, in this case the youth, for the next 2-3 generations.
Yes, we are in danger of that. And the way that we can overcome that is a very simple thing. It's about not having some kind of ideal poster child version of youth that we look out for in the country. I personally have got a little bit of an uneasiness with something like the top 200 mail-in Guardian list. I know many people who are on the list, and they're great, and they should be celebrated. But I also know that it's only a certain type of young person who's ever going to be on the list. And I know that that young person is going to, again, be held as the golden standard. But the young person who's working tirelessly in a community somewhere in Gabon is never going to make it onto the list, and is now going to be held up and compared to somebody who's been put onto the mail-in Guardian list without any context. Any context of how hard this one young person would need to work just to organize a community meeting. And said, well, you should be doing much better than you're doing right now. But we know that somebody who got into the mail-in Guardian list probably had the opportunity to at least go to university, to at least have certain access to certain privileges, to certain power, to certain support. And so we mustn't get to the point where we see some young people's achievements as more important than others. We must start seeing young people when they do things and they make contributions in their own right as part of the solution.
Well, how do we overcome that then? Meaning, I understand the disparity between Gabon and someone living in Houghton in Johannesburg in South Africa, but mass media and just popular culture is very much fueled by who's first, who's best. We all indulge in that, right? So I think your point about this activist fixing up something in Gabon being equal, if not better, to somebody who may well have been at Fees Must Fall is I think is very clear. But in the absence of mass media having an interest in the person from Gabon, do we still then not acknowledge the top 200, or what? Meaning, how do we get to acknowledging both? Keeping in mind that it's possible the Gabon young person's achievement of maybe even feeding 10 people could be greater than someone's achievement of leading a march with 10,000 people because of the relative disparities in terms of their positions.
It goes back to what I was saying earlier about what we think youth development is and what's the picture of success. We need to change our checklist. So the checklist can't be went to university, tick, started a company, tick, was able to make their first million, tick. We need to change what the parameters for success are. And I think back to growing up and being in El Dorado Park, in my small community. For me, what constituted success at that point was very different from what I found when I went to university. Being able to be seen as a young person who was successful was somebody who was always punctual, somebody who always stood by their word and delivered when they said they were going to deliver, somebody who treated other people with high levels of respect, somebody who gave their time to the community, irrespective of what they were doing, somebody who nurtured their talents and used their talents well. When I was 18, for me, that was the picture of success for a young person in my community. And I almost want to transport that again to the rest of the country and say, let's not say that you are only successful when you look a certain way or you sound a certain way. Let's think about what qualities we want to see in young people. And whenever we see those qualities in those young people, let's affirm them. Let's celebrate them. Let's let them know they're recognized. Let's take them and mentor them. Let's make sure it's the qualities we want to see rather than just a checklist of achievements.
Two things that, and then we can wrap up with what I think has been a fascinating insight into youth and their goals and their aspirations. One is, what is your sense then, by and large, do the youth that you interact with, do they see themselves as part of the solution? And these could be youth who are underprivileged as well as privileged. I mean, where do they see themselves fitting into South Africa 2020 to 2030?
Until they feel like you are taking them seriously, they generally value how much they do, how much they give, what they see. The sense of being marginalized, apathy, is actually youth marginalization. And so young people feel marginalized, but they don't feel disempowered, if that makes sense. They don't feel like they have no power. They just don't feel like their power is part of the mainstream. I'll give you an example of some work we did in the Planning Commission with young people with disabilities. And one of the first things that group said to us was, disability is not inability. They said, people treat us like we are unable to contribute, when we're just differently able to contribute. That we do have, they focus on the thing that we don't have. And I think you could extrapolate that to the broader contingent of young people, where we're focusing so much on the things that they don't have, that we don't acknowledge and encourage and bring in and value the things that they do have and the things that they do contribute. I think if we started to look at young people differently and started seeing them less as, the poor beneficiaries of our programs, and started to see them as partners in their own development and in our development as a country, we started to look at them as leaders, people who we are willing to have lead us, then you see a change in what they'll bring to the table. But they're not going to throw their pearls, as it were, before swine. They're not going to throw their pearls before people they don't trust will value them. The thing that has made young people respond to me as a youth worker is the idea that I walk into the room saying, I want to learn from you as a young person. I'm not here to teach you something. I'm here to learn from you. And I want to be led by you. I stand firm in it today that I want to be led by a 25-year-old president in my lifetime. I'm going to be that 25-year-old president. But I want to be the climate that is needed to see young people flourish.
If it's not happening for all the reasons we've spoken about earlier, that for whatever reason youth are reduced to, protest in terms of their true value of development, is it then not time for youth to create their own vehicles of influence at the highest levels, meaning their own political parties?
So again, I don't believe in young people having a youth-specific political party. So youth is not a constituency per se. Youth is a transitionary period. And I think what happens when you create youth as this constituency, it then becomes hard to leave it behind. It becomes hard when you're no longer a youth to stop identifying as a young person because of the investment you've made. So for me with Youth Lab, one of the things that's been so great for me in terms of Youth Lab has been the ability for me to say, as a young person in a youth-led organization, I made my contribution and I can move on. That becomes way more difficult when you're talking about a political party and power and this and that. And so for that reason, I think youth as a constituency is a bit of a problematic thing. But the more important issue is the mainstreaming issue. And that when you say, okay, this is a youth only party, what are youth issues? If the majority of your country is youth, then every issue is a youth issue. And every party needs to take young people seriously. And I shouldn't be voting for you because you are youth. I should be voting for young people because they can add value across the board. And if young people just decide to, cocoon themselves and only work for their own interests, they would also be missing the point. We are here in service of all of society. We are good enough to lead all of society. The African Union Youth Envoy puts it very well when she says that part of the mission of this generation is to become co-leaders of society and embody co-leadership, where young people and adults can sit as co-leaders of the society, as opposed to saying youth must lead because they are young people.
What and then we'll wrap up. What your thoughts on the role of Parliament, people voted into Parliament to lead as they do now, and their overall effectiveness versus the role of people outside of Parliament? And of course, I must include the word youth in all this discussion.
So what do I expect from young MPs, from MPs who fall into the category of youth? The first thing that I expect from them is competence. I expect them to be competent in the role that they have, effective in their ability to hold government to account and to hold the executive to account, effective in their role as legislators. The second thing I expect is representation, and for them to make the point that young people can rely on them, can call them, that they're accessible to young people, to hear them out, and that they're not just there to be placeholders for their parties. And then the final thing that I expect from young MPs, more than anything, to be honest, is to lobby within their parties to create space for more young people. That they should be there to say, can you see I'm here? Can you see I'm adding value out there? And can you let us in the door? And not because, again, young people are some special breed and that we just want to get rid of all older people, but because they can demonstrate the value, the unique things that young people can bring to a conversation and can bring to the machinery. For young people who are outside of Parliament, who are outside of government, and I really hope that, especially now that we're heading towards young people, independent candidacy, that we'll see more young people take up independent candidacy and contest and win. But for those who never want to go into politics and who never want to be inside the state's machinery, I expect also from them competency. But more importantly than anything, I expect them to hold their representatives to account. I really expect them to be there and say, you are voted in. I'm not only going to vote, I'm also going to hold you to a direct account between elections.
Would you stand for election now?
I probably wouldn't. And that's not because I don't think young people or younger people or people who haven't been involved in politics should. But I do think that there are people who want to be in those kinds of spaces, and there are people who want to support them. And I've always thought of myself as somebody who can enable. And sometimes when you get into the top position or into the role, it becomes more limiting. And so I've always found that I'm a better enabler of people than I am necessarily the face and the voice of a political space. So for that reason, probably
Right.
not.
Lastly, if you had to send a direct message to the President of South Africa, so dear Mr. President, you'll tell him what, and a message to the Secretary General of the United Nations, what would you tell both of them? It could be two different messages, of course.
Cool. Dear Mr. President, two things. Don't stay too long. And in your party, recognize and push for opening up of spaces for young people. And maybe the last thing is allow young people to be part of the solution in the country. For the head of the UN, get your house in order. Oh no, let me let me be serious. I think for the head of the UN, we need to move beyond sloganeering about young people and seeing young people as people that we're programming for, and partner more with youth organizations. I think that UN agencies don't do enough to partner with youth in their local communities and in their local context. And so I would want UN organizations to be much more connected to and partnering with young people, and not just have young people as rhetoric or tokenism.
Well, that's where we can leave it. Tessa Dooms, great chatting to you. It's been a privilege getting your insights as you shared for us the big picture into youth activism. And I think the point that we need to leave it with is that phrase, children are the future. Well, you've just given every case for us to believe that the children are very much, in this case, maybe the youth are not just the future, but children are youth are very much the now, and need to be taken and expected. And policy needs to be put into place, embracing that fact that the youth are the now. So thank you for your time.
Cool. It was great chatting.
Thank you.